The most feared man in Seattle was denied a private room on his 33rd birthday, until a baker with flour on her dress changed everything. The hostess looked at him as if he were something unpleasant she had found stuck to the bottom of her designer heel. She said she was sorry, though nothing in her tone suggested she meant it. Without a reservation, she could not accommodate him. Elysian had a strict policy. Ashton Kane stood there with rain from the Seattle storm still clinging to his black coat, and felt something inside him crack. It was not anger. It was something worse. Emptiness. He said that he understood there had been a miscommunication. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that made powerful men uneasy. He needed a table. Tonight. The hostess replied that it was their busiest evening of the year. Without a reservation under his name, there was simply nothing she could do. She did not even bother to look up from her screen. Perhaps, she suggested, he might try somewhere less exclusive. He could have made one phone call, one word to Brooks, and by morning this restaurant would have a new owner. He controlled half the underground economy of the Pacific Northwest. He had erased rivals, built empires, and survived betrayals that would have destroyed lesser men. But tonight, Ashton Kane had no reservation, because the only person who handled such things was lying in a hospital bed. Tonight, he could not reveal who he was, because anonymity was the only thing keeping him alive. Tonight, the most dangerous man in Seattle could not get a table because he had become too good at disappearing. And the cruelest irony of all was this. He had no one to call. No friend waiting to meet him. No family to celebrate with. 15 years spent building an empire of fear, and he had exactly 0 people who wanted to share a meal with him on his birthday. 33 years old. More money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Enough power to ruin anyone who crossed him. And yet he was standing in the lobby of a restaurant, being dismissed by a 24-year-old hostess who saw nothing but a man without a reservation. The humiliation was absolute. Then a voice came from behind him, clear, steady, and utterly without fear. She said that she believed this gentleman was joining their table. Ashton turned and saw a woman rising from a corner booth. Her chestnut hair was slipping free from a messy bun. She wore a simple black dress, and there seemed to be a dusting of flour on one shoulder. Her eyes were the color of warm amber, and she looked directly at him without the faintest trace of fear or recognition. She did not know who he was. She did not know what he had done. She only saw a man being turned away on a rain-soaked night, and she decided to help. The hostess began to object, but the woman cut her off with a smile that was somehow both gentle and unmovable. She introduced herself as Reese Fuller. Table 7 had been reserved for 2, she said, and now it would be 3. This man was her guest. There had been a misunderstanding about timing, entirely her fault. She said it in the shape of a question, but her tone made it clear that it was not one. She trusted there would be no problem. The hostess's face moved through confusion, irritation, and at last surrender. "Of course," she said. "Right this way." Ashton followed in a daze, his mind struggling to understand what was happening. When was the last time someone had helped him without knowing what they might gain in return? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen a person rather than a threat? He could not remember. Reese led him to a corner booth where a young man sat with a cane propped against the table, looking up with curious eyes. She introduced Ashton only after pausing to glance at him. "Ashton," he said. "Just Ashton. No last name, no title, no reputation." She repeated his name, then told the young man that Ashton was joining them for dinner. The young man, who Ashton would later learn was her brother, lifted an eyebrow and asked whether this was another of her rescue missions, because last week it had been a stray cat, and now it was a man in a $1,000 coat. Reese answered simply that everyone deserved a table on a rainy night, especially when they were alone. Alone. The word struck Ashton like a bullet, because she was right. He was alone, entirely, brutally alone, and somehow this stranger with flour on her dress had seen it in the space of 3 seconds. What Ashton did not yet know was that this woman, this baker who rescued strangers, hired broken people, and believed that everyone deserved a second chance, would tear down every wall he had spent 15 years building. He did not know that her past was as dark as his own, filled with betrayal, survival, and scars that had never fully healed. He did not know that enemies were already watching, waiting for any weakness they could use against him, and that loving her would make her the greatest target of all. He did not know that in 6 months, he would have to choose between the empire he had built with blood and the future she would make him believe was possible. All he knew, in that moment, was that a stranger had offered him a seat at her table. And for the first time in 15 years, Ashton Kane did not want to be alone. Press the subscribe button and stay with us, because the most feared man in Seattle is about to meet the one person he cannot intimidate, cannot buy, and cannot walk away from. Now let me take you back to that storm-swept evening in November, when everything changed. Ashton slid into the seat across from the young man, feeling as though he were stepping into an entirely foreign world. Somehow, this small table tucked into the corner of an elegant restaurant felt warmer than any private dining room he had ever sat in. Wesley stared at him openly, making no effort to hide his curiosity, the cane resting against the edge of the table like a quiet reminder of the story he carried within himself. "So what is your story?" Wesley asked bluntly, with no attempt at politeness or detour. "A guy in a $1,000 coat eating alone on a Friday night?" Ashton blinked. How long had it been since anyone had dared ask him something so directly? In his world, people were either too afraid to open their mouths or too eager to please him to speak honestly. No one asked straight questions. No one looked him in the eye as though he were simply an ordinary man. "Private security," he said, choosing the safest half-truth he had. "A business dinner fell through." Wesley tilted his head, clearly not completely convinced, but he did not press. Then his eyes landed on the birthday voucher sticking out from Ashton's jacket pocket, the one the restaurant had sent him the month before when Brooks made the reservation. "Wait," Wesley said, his eyes widening. "Is that a birthday voucher? It is your birthday? And everyone ditched you?" Ashton's silence answered more clearly than any words could have. He could see Wesley and Reese exchange a glance, a wordless conversation between a brother and sister who had long since learned how to speak without speaking. "Well," Reese said gently, smoothly steering the moment in another direction, "then you definitely picked the right table. Wesley and I are celebrating his scholarship, so now we have 2 reasons to celebrate." She smiled, and Ashton noticed how that smile transformed her whole face, lighting up those amber eyes. "Tell me, Ashton, do you like cupcakes?" "Cupcakes?" he repeated, as though it were a word from some unfamiliar language. "I own a bakery," Reese explained. "Sweet second chances. It is small, nothing fancy, but it is mine." "She is being modest," Wesley cut in. "The place is amazing. She built it from nothing. We hire women who need a second chance," Reese continued, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a quiet pride woven together with a deeper sense of purpose. "Some escaped terrible situations. Some just need someone to believe in them. Everyone deserves a second chance, you know?" Ashton listened, truly listened. For the first time in years, he was sitting with people who wanted nothing from him. They did not know that he could hand them lucrative contracts or destroy their enemies. They only saw a lonely man on a rainy night and chose to share their dinner with him. "Reese worked 3 jobs to pay my hospital bills after my accident," Wesley said, his voice softening. 3 jobs, for 2 years. She barely slept 4 hours a night. He looked at his sister with an expression Ashton immediately recognized as pure reverence. "She is basically a superhero in an apron." Ashton looked at Reese, and this time he truly saw her, not only as the woman with flour on her shoulder who had saved him from humiliation, but as someone who had fought, sacrificed, and built something out of nothing. Like him, in a way. The difference was that she had built with love, while he had built with fear. Dinner passed in laughter and stories. Wesley talked about his business major and his dream of launching a startup. Reese talked about the women who worked at the bakery, about Martha, whose hands trembled whenever a loud man raised his voice, about the women who had found themselves again in that small kitchen fragrant with vanilla. Ashton mostly listened, answering the occasional simple question, careful not to reveal too much. But strangely, he did not feel as though he were hiding. He felt as though he were resting. Then, as if the universe had decided the night still had not offered him enough surprises, a server appeared carrying a small cake with a flickering candle on top. "For the birthday, gentlemen," she said with a professional smile. "Compliments of Elysian." Wesley and Reese looked at each other, and then both of them began to sing. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ashton. Happy birthday to you." Their voices were not perfect. Wesley was slightly off-key, and Reese laughed halfway through, but they sang, for him, a stranger they had met less than an hour before. Ashton closed his eyes and blew out the candle. In that moment, he made a wish. Not for money, because he already had more than enough, Not for power, because he already held it in his hands. He wished for the simplest thing, and the one farthest beyond his reach. More nights like this. The last time anyone had sung happy birthday to him was 20 years earlier, when his mother was still alive. She had made a chocolate cake with fresh cream, and sung in a trembling voice, made fragile by illness, yet still full of love. Since she died, Ashton's birthday had become just another day, and sometimes he even forgot it altogether. He opened his eyes and found Reese looking at him. She was smiling, but in those amber eyes there was something deeper, as though she could see exactly what he was feeling. And something shifted inside Ashton's chest. A wall cracked. A door eased open. For the first time in 15 years, he felt that he could breathe. Dinner ended too quickly. Ashton realized he did not want to leave that small table in the corner of the restaurant, did not want to return to the real world where he was Ashton Kane, the most feared crime lord in Seattle. When the check arrived, he took it before Reese could even reach for it. "I have got this," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Reese frowned. "Ashton, you do not have to. This was supposed to be our treat." "Well, Wesley's scholarship treat, but still, consider it a thank you," Ashton replied, laying down his credit card without looking at the amount. "You gave me something money usually cannot buy. A birthday worth remembering." Wesley let out a soft whistle when he saw the kind of black card Ashton used, the sort he had only ever seen in movies, but Reese only looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. She was not impressed by money, Ashton realized. She was impressed by the person, and that made her different from everyone he had ever known. Outside the restaurant, the rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and cold. Reese pulled a small card from her purse, its corner slightly bent from being tucked among the clutter inside. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "If you ever need a cupcake, or a second chance, sweet second chances, an address, a phone number, and a small logo of a cupcake with wings." Ashton held the card as though it were something far more precious than a scrap of paper. "Thank you," he said, and was surprised to realize he truly meant it. For everything. Reese smiled, that warm smile that had haunted him all through dinner. "Happy birthday, Ashton. I hope next year you will not have to eat with strangers." "Maybe I like strangers," he replied, and something flickered in her eyes before Wesley cut in. "All right, lovebirds. Some of us have classes tomorrow." He grinned broadly when both Reese and Ashton looked flustered. "Come on, sis. Let us walk before it starts raining again." Ashton watched them go, two figures beneath the streetlights, Wesley limping slightly with his cane, and Reese slowing her pace to match her brother's. They did not call a cab, even though the night was cold and the streets were still wet. Saving money, he understood. They had spent on that expensive dinner to celebrate Wesley's scholarship, and Ashton knew exactly what that meant to the budget of a small bakery. He stood there watching until they disappeared around the corner, until even the shape of them dissolved into the night. Then he walked to the car waiting at the corner, the one where Brooks usually sat. But tonight, he did not want anyone to drive for him. Ashton slipped behind the wheel himself and drove away, not back to the penthouse, but through Seattle, like a lost man. He drove past Pike Place Market after it had closed, through familiar streets he controlled but had never truly looked at. At last he stopped at Alki Beach, where the city lights reflected across the black water of Elliott Bay like a million stars fallen into the sea. His phone vibrated. "Brooks. Boss, everything okay? I heard you left alone." "I am fine," Ashton said, and his voice sounded strange even to himself, softer, tired in an entirely different way. "Take the night off." There was silence on the other end. Brooks had been with him for 20 years, and this was likely the first time he had ever heard Ashton speak like that. "Yes, boss." Ashton sat in the car for hours, the bakery card in his hand. He looked at it, his fingers brushing across the words, "sweet second chances," and wondered, when was the last time someone helped me without knowing what they could get? When was the last time I felt seen? He could not remember. Maybe never. Maybe that was why tonight felt like a dream he was afraid to wake from. At last, when dawn began to stain the horizon with pink, Ashton slipped the card into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, the one closest to his heart. He drove back to the penthouse, the apartment on the top floor with its sweeping view of the city and its expensive interior. But for the first time in 15 years, it no longer felt like home. It was only the place where he slept, the place where he existed between wars and schemes. Standing by the window, Looking out toward the distant shoreline, Ashton thought of Alki Beach, of the lights on the water, of Reese's smile. Maybe someday, he whispered to himself, but he did not finish the thought. He did not yet know what that someday was. He only knew that for the first time in a very long while, he wanted there to be a someday. A week passed, and Ashton could not stop thinking about the card in his jacket pocket. He had taken it out and looked at it at least 10 times a day, his fingers brushing across the words, sweet second chances, as though they were a map leading to another world. And now here he was, standing on the sidewalk across from the little bakery on a quiet corner, unable to make himself go inside. 10 minutes passed. Ashton Kane, the man who made Seattle's entire underworld tremble, was rooted in place in front of a bakery. He had dressed more simply today, just a black shirt and dark trousers, no suit, no expensive watch, but he knew he still stood out. Still did not belong in a place like this with its white painted wooden tables and checkered curtains. His phone vibrated. Brooks, sitting in a car parked a few yards away. "Boss, this is unusual." "I know," Ashton replied, his eyes still fixed on the bakery's glass door. "That is why I am doing it," silence answered him from the other end. Brooks had been with him long enough to know when not to ask more questions. Ashton slipped the phone away and at last stepped through the door. A little bell chimed overhead as he entered, and immediately he was wrapped in the scent of butter, vanilla, and freshly baked bread. The shop was smaller than he had imagined, with only a few tables and a display case filled with cupcakes in every color. Sunlight streamed through the windows, laying warm golden streaks across the wooden floor. It was nothing like his world, where everything was cold, shadowed, and calculated. Reese was standing behind the counter, her hair tied up high and exposing the pale line of her neck, her apron dusted with flour, a streak of frosting on her cheek that she did not seem to notice. She looked up when the bell rang, and her amber eyes widened for the briefest moment before a smile touched her mouth. "The birthday guy," she said, surprise in her voice but not the slightest hint of displeasure. "I thought you might be a one-time miracle." "I wanted to try your cupcakes," Ashton said as he came toward the counter. "You mentioned them." Reese tilted her head, studying him with that assessing look he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers. Then she turned, chose a chocolate cupcake from the display, and set it in front of him. "House special. On the house." Ashton picked up the small cake and realized he did not know what to do with it. The thought was almost absurd, but how long had it been since he had eaten a cupcake with his own hands? How long had it been since he had done something as ordinary as sitting in a bakery and enjoying something sweet? He took a bite, carefully, as though he were trying to disarm a bomb. "You eat cupcakes like you are diffusing a bomb," Reese laughed, watching him with amused delight. "It is only sugar and butter. Relax." Ashton did not know how to explain that he had forgotten how to relax a very long time ago, so instead, he only nodded and tried to eat more normally, though he was not at all certain what normal even looked like anymore. He sat at a table near the window, observing the bakery the way he would have observed new territory. But instead of looking for weaknesses and opportunities, he found himself watching the way Reese ran the place. She spoke to her staff in a gentle, patient voice. She remembered the name of every regular customer and asked after their families. She was especially tender with Martha, a young woman of about 22, who kept her head lowered and whose hands trembled whenever a male customer came too close. Ashton recognized the signs. He had seen enough to know that Martha was carrying wounds that had not yet healed. Then a male customer began raising his voice because his order had been wrong. "This is not what I ordered. Can you people not do anything right?" Martha went pale and stepped back, her hands beginning to shake. Ashton saw her body draw inward, as though she were bracing for a blow. His instincts urged him to rise and deal with the man himself. In Ashton's world, no one was allowed to treat his people that way. But before he could even move, Reese was already there. She came out from behind the counter and stood between Martha and the customer. Not aggressive, but not retreating either. "I apologize for the mistake, sir," she said, her voice gentle, but her eyes like steel wrapped in velvet. "We will fix it right away. But I would appreciate it if you lowered your voice. You are frightening my staff." The man opened his mouth as if to say something more, but there was something in the way Reese stood, in the way she looked directly into his eyes, that made him stop. In the end, he lowered his voice, accepted the corrected order, and left without causing any further trouble. Ashton watched it all, and a thought slowly formed in his mind. She runs this place the way I run my empire. Protect your people first. But there was one great difference. She protected with warmth, by stepping forward and speaking. He protected with fear, with violence and threat. The outcome might be the same, but the road leading there was completely different. Maybe there is another way, he thought, watching Reese return behind the counter and gently pat Martha on the shoulder in comfort. Maybe I have been doing it wrong all along. The next 3 weeks passed like a dream Ashton did not want to wake from. He came to the bakery almost every day, sometimes only to drink coffee and sit at the table by the window, sometimes to talk with Reese in the quiet moments between customers. But there were 3 particular moments that carved themselves into his memory, moments that changed him in ways he never could have expected. The first came when he noticed that the bakery door had a broken hinge. It would not close properly and let out a tired creak every time someone came in or out. Reese had mentioned in passing that she would call a repairman when she had time, but Ashton knew she was putting it off because of the cost. That night, he sat in his penthouse and watched YouTube for 5 straight hours, learning how to fix a door hinge. He, a man who had never done anything with his own hands except things tied to violence and power, was teaching himself how to use a screwdriver from a video with 3 million views. The next morning, he showed up at the bakery carrying a toolbox that Brooks had stared at, as if his boss had lost his mind. Reese opened the door and stood there gaping when she saw Ashton Kane, sleeves rolled up, wrestling with the broken hinge. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice caught somewhere between surprise and amusement. "Fixing your door?" he replied as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, even though he was holding the screwdriver upside down. At that exact moment, Wesley appeared. He stopped in the doorway, looked at Ashton, looked at the toolbox, then looked back at Ashton. "Okay, who is this guy, and what did he do with the scary suit man from the restaurant?" Ashton did not answer. He kept struggling with the hinge. And somehow, after 45 minutes and more than a few clumsy attempts, he actually fixed it. The door opened and closed smoothly. No more creaking. For the first time in his life, Ashton had done something with his own hands that had nothing to do with violence or destruction. The feeling was strange, almost as if he had discovered a part of himself he had never known existed. Reese brought him out a plate of pastries as thanks, and when she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. Only for a second, but Ashton felt it like a current running through him. They both pretended not to notice, but he saw the faint flush rising in her cheeks when she turned away. The second moment came a week later, when the bakery suddenly closed for the day. Ashton arrived and found a closed sign hanging on the door, and something inside him tightened with a kind of worry he was not used to feeling. He called Reese and heard at once how rough and exhausted her voice sounded. "The flu." "Nothing serious," she told him. She just needed a day of rest. But Ashton could not let it go. He ordered his private chef to make chicken porridge from the best recipe he knew, then delivered it to Reese's small apartment himself. When she opened the door, nose red, hair in disarray, wearing old pajamas covered in cartoon cats, Ashton thought she had never looked more beautiful. "You really do not have to," she began, but he had already stepped past her and gone inside. "I know," he said, setting the container of porridge on the table. "That is why I am here. Because I want to be, not because I have to be." Reese looked at him, then at the porridge, then back at him again. She said nothing. She only gave him a weak smile and sat down on the sofa. Ashton stayed the entire afternoon. He did nothing remarkable. He simply sat in an old armchair and read a book he had found on her shelf, while Reese slept on the sofa. The apartment was small, the furniture inexpensive, but it was warm in a way his penthouse had never been. And for the first time in years, Ashton felt peace, without needing liquor, without needing that empty kind of silence. All he needed was the steady sound of Reese breathing and the afternoon light slipping through the curtains. But not everything was gentle. Ashton had quietly assigned people to watch over Reese and Wesley from the very beginning, a natural reflex in a man who had spent his life protecting whatever belonged to him. And one evening, his phone vibrated with an urgent message from one of his men. Wesley was in trouble. Ashton arrived in 10 minutes, just in time to see 3 men cornering Wesley against a wall near the university. "Your sister owes money to her ex-husband," one of them was saying. "Tell her to pay up, or else." Wesley stood straight despite the pain in his leg, gripping his cane as though it were the only weapon he had. He was afraid. Ashton could see that plainly. But he did not back down. Ashton stepped out of the shadows. He did not hurry. He did not come in with aggression. He only walked forward, stood between Wesley and the men, and looked directly into the leader's eyes. "Walk away," he said. Just 2 words. His voice was not loud. It was not angry, but there was something in the way he stood, in those steel-gray eyes, in the deadly stillness that seemed to radiate from him. All 3 men froze. The leader, who had been hurling threats only a moment earlier, suddenly went pale, as if he had just looked death in the face. They left without another word, nearly fleeing into the night. Wesley stood there, eyes wide. "How did you know I was in trouble?" he asked once he had steadied himself. "Lucky timing," Ashton replied, his face unreadable. Wesley looked at him, clearly not believing a word of it, but he did not ask any more questions. Instead, he said, "Okay, now I am actually scared of you, but also grateful. This is very confusing." Ashton almost smiled. Almost. "Get used to it," he said, then walked Wesley all the way to Reese's apartment door, making sure he was safe before disappearing back into the night. That night, after the last customer had gone and Martha had already headed home, Ashton stayed behind to help Reese clean up. He did not ask. He simply rose and began stacking the chairs onto the tables as naturally as if it were something he did every day. Reese did not object. She only smiled and continued wiping down the counter. When everything was finally in order, she made 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. They sat at the small table by the window, soft golden light resting over her face, the scent of cake and vanilla still lingering in the air. Outside, Seattle had already sunk into night, and the streetlights cast blurred ribbons of light through the glass. It was the first time they had truly been alone together, with no Wesley, no customers, no one stepping between them, and in that quiet, the walls began to come down. "Wesley told me what you did," Reese said, her fingers slowly turning the coffee cup in her hands. "Those men who threatened him. He said you just appeared, like a ghost, and they ran without you even doing anything." Ashton did not answer. He only took a sip of his coffee. "Who are you, Ashton?" she asked, her voice unafraid, touched only by genuine curiosity. "Really? Someone who has done things you would not want to know about," he answered honestly. "Someone who spent 15 years building something and forgot why he was building it." Reese looked at him, and in those amber eyes he saw no judgment, only understanding, as if she knew exactly what that feeling was. "My mother died when I was 18, she began, her voice light as drifting air. "Cancer." I held her hand until the end. The last thing she said was take care of Wesley, and I promised. I promised I would. Ashton listened without interrupting. "My father did not take it well," Reese went on. "He started drinking. He never hit us, but his words..." She stopped, swallowing hard. "His words left bruises that took longer to heal than any fist ever could. He called me worthless, said I would never amount to anything, said Mom was lucky she died so she would not have to see what a disappointment I was." She lowered her eyes to her coffee cup, as though she were staring into the past itself. "When I was 20, he took all the money Mom had left us and disappeared. Just like that. No goodbye. No explanation. Only an empty bank account and a note that said, 'You are on your own now.'" Ashton felt anger flare in his chest, not for himself but for her, for the 20-year-old girl left behind with a younger brother depending on her. "I thought I found someone," Reese continued, a bitter smile touching her mouth. "Drew Mercer. I was 22, desperate, alone. He was charming, said all the right things. I wanted so badly to believe someone could love me that I ignored every red flag." "What happened?" Ashton asked, though he already knew the answer would hurt. "He was a con artist, married me, maxed out every credit card in my name, took everything we had, and vanished. Left me with debt I could not even begin to count." She drew in a long breath. "Then when I was 24, Wesley had his accident. He needed surgery, no insurance, no money. Just me and a stack of medical bills taller than I was. How did you survive?" "I worked 3 jobs. Slept 4 hours a night for 2 years. Waitressing in the morning, working at a grocery store in the afternoon, cleaning offices at night. Every penny went to Wesley's medical bills and his education." She lifted her gaze and met Ashton's eyes. "Everyone has a sob story, Ashton. Mine just taught me one thing. Waiting for someone to save you is a waste of time. You save yourself. And then, if you can, You help save others. That is why I started this bakery. That is why I hire women like Martha. Silence settled over them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had seen darkness and survived it. My father died when I was 18 too, Ashton said at last. He was in business, a very specific kind of business. When he died, I had to take over. I did not have a choice. He looked out through the window, his gaze distant. I have spent 15 years building something. An empire, they call it. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I was building it. I forgot there was supposed to be something more than just surviving. He said no more. Nothing about blood, or violence, or the sleepless nights spent knowing enemies were always watching. Reese did not press. She simply reached across the table and laid her small hand over his. Ashton looked down at her hand resting on his, a hand roughened by work, a hand that had kneaded dough and wiped away tears and rebuilt a life from ashes. He did not pull away. Neither did she. Whatever secrets you are carrying, Ashton, Reese said softly, they will still be there tomorrow. This place does not fix people. It just gives them room to breathe. Can I keep coming back? He asked, and hated the way his voice sounded as though he were pleading. Reese looked straight at him, her amber eyes bright beneath the golden light. The door is always open, she said. Just do not make me regret it. 2 months passed like a beautiful dream Ashton scarcely dared believe was real. He came to the bakery almost every day, and it had become an essential part of his routine. Mornings were for handling business. Afternoons were for sweet second chances, for sitting at his familiar table by the window, reading a book, or simply watching Reese work. The staff had grown used to seeing him. They even remembered his order without needing to ask. Martha no longer looked frightened when he walked in. Instead, the young woman smiled now and asked after him like he was one of their regulars. Wesley, whenever he stopped by to see his sister, called him the cupcake guy with a mischievous grin. Reese and Ashton were not officially dating yet. They had not put a name to whatever it was growing between them. But anyone could see that something was taking shape in the way they looked at each other, in the quiet moments they shared after closing, in the way their hands brushed by accident, and neither one seemed eager to pull away. Everything was perfect. Until that afternoon, the bell over the door rang, and 2 young women stepped inside. Both of them were dressed expensively, carrying designer handbags, their nails polished with obvious care. One of them, a girl with elaborately curled blonde hair whom Ashton would later learn was named Nina, was laughing with her friend when her gaze happened to sweep across the bakery and stop at the corner where he sat. She froze. Her smile died on her lips, and all the color drained from her face as though she had just seen a ghost. Ashton did not notice because he was reading. Reese did. From behind the counter, she saw the strange reaction in the customer's face, saw the way the girl quickly turned away and pulled her friend toward the farthest corner of the bakery. Nina whispered to her friend, but in the hush of the small shop, her voice carried far enough for Reese to hear every word. "That is Ashton Kane," Nina said, shooting a frightened glance in Ashton's direction. "The Ashton Kane. Oh my God, who?" her friend asked, clearly confused. "My dad works for him. Well, not directly, but everyone in the business knows that face. He is like one of the most dangerous men on the West Coast. People say he has killed." Nina did not finish because her friend clapped a hand over her mouth. "Shh, he will hear you." They hurried through their order, paid as though they were throwing the money onto the counter, and left without daring to look toward Ashton again. Through it all, he kept reading, completely unaware. But Reese knew. The hand holding her coffee cup trembled, and she had to set it down before she dropped it. She looked across at Ashton, the man who had become a part of her life, the man who had fixed her door, brought her soup when she was sick, protected her brother, the man she was beginning to care for. And she found herself wondering what she truly knew about him at all. That night, after she returned to her apartment, Reese sat in front of her laptop and typed into Google, "Ashton Kane, Seattle." The results flooded the screen. Articles about a mysterious businessman whose empire no one could clearly define. Rumors of underground dealings and shadowed transactions. Stories about people who disappeared after crossing the Kane Empire. About business rivals ruined for reasons no one could quite explain. About enemies who were simply never seen again. Reese kept reading until 3 in the morning, and every article, every rumor, every story felt like a blade cutting into her heart. The next day, Reese waited until the bakery had closed. She sent Martha home early, lying and saying she could finish cleaning by herself. Ashton stayed behind as usual, unaware that everything was shifting beneath his feet. When the door closed behind the last employee, and only the two of them remained in the silent bakery, Reese turned to him. "Kane Empire?" she said, her voice so calm it sounded cold. I looked it up. Ashton set his book down and looked at her. There was no surprise in his eyes, only acceptance. He had known this moment would come. He just had not expected it to come so soon. "They say you are one of the most dangerous men on the West Coast," Reese continued, her voice still steady even though her heart was pounding wildly. "They say people who cross you disappear." Ashton said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Everything they say is probably true, or worse." The honesty in his voice struck Reese like a blow to the chest. She had hoped he would deny it, would explain it away, would say it was all malicious rumor, but he did not. He admitted it. He admitted everything. "Then why are you here?" she asked, and now her voice began to shake. "In my little bakery, eating cupcakes like a normal person? What do you want from me?" Ashton stood, and Reese had to fight the urge to step back. He did not move toward her. He only stood there, his gray eyes fixed on hers with something in them she had never seen before. Fragility. "Because in here, for a few hours, I am not Ashton Kane with all the blood and debts and enemies," he said, his voice low and slow, as though every word cost him something. "I am just a man who likes your cupcakes, and your company, and the way you see people without judging them first." He stopped and swallowed. "I have done things I cannot undo, Reese, things that would make you sick if you knew. I am the monster they say I am. I have never pretended otherwise. Then why? But with you," he continued, and now his voice was nearly a whisper, "I remember there might be something else underneath, something I thought died a long time ago, when my father died and I had to become what I am. Something human." Silence filled the bakery. Reese looked at him, this man she had thought she understood, and realized she knew nothing at all. But she also saw something else in his eyes: honesty, fragility, and a fear she had never imagined she would see in the man said to be the most terrifying in Seattle: the fear of losing her. Reese said nothing for one long minute. The silence hung between them like a blade, and every passing second cut deeper into Ashton. He stood there, waiting for the inevitable. She would throw him out, or call the police, or worse, look at him with the same fear he had seen in the eyes of hundreds of others. He was used to fear in other people's eyes. It was his tool, his weapon, the thing that had kept him alive for 15 years in the underworld, but not from her, not from Reese. If she looked at him that way, he did not know what he would do. But Reese did not scream. She did not cry. She did not run. Instead, she did the one thing Ashton least expected. She sat down in the chair across from him, placed both hands on the table, and looked straight into his eyes. No fear, no judgment, only the strange calm of someone who had faced too much darkness to still tremble before it. "I survived my father's cruelty when I was 15, she began, her voice steady. "Not his fists. I told you he never hit us, but his words were worse. I survived years of believing I was worthless because of him." She paused and took a deep breath. "I survived my ex-husband's lies when I was 22. I survived waking up one day and realizing everything I thought I knew was fake, that the man I married was a con artist who saw me as nothing more than a mark. I survived poverty, debt, working 3 jobs until I could not remember the last time I had slept more than 4 hours. I survived almost losing Wesley, sitting in that hospital waiting room not knowing whether he would ever walk again." She looked at him, and in those amber eyes Ashton saw the strength of someone who had gone through hell and made it back. "I know what dangerous men look like, Ashton. I have lived with one. I was married to one. I can smell danger from a mile away." "Then you know what I am," Ashton said, his voice low. "Yes," Reese nodded. "I know what you are. I have known from the beginning that something was off. Normal men do not have that look in their eyes. Normal men do not make a room full of thugs run just by standing there." She tilted her head, studying him as though she were trying to solve a puzzle. "I have learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts say you are dangerous. Probably more dangerous than anyone I have ever met." Ashton did not argue. She was right. "But they also say something else." "What?" he asked, and hated the way his voice sounded as though he were holding his breath. "That you have never once made me feel unsafe," Reese said. "Not once. In 2 months. You have had 100 chances to hurt me, to manipulate me, to use me for whatever game you are playing. But you did not. You fixed my door. You brought me soup when I was sick. You protected my brother." She paused, as though weighing every word. "I do not know whether that makes me stupid or brave. Probably stupid. But I am not running away." Ashton felt something inside his chest loosen, as though he had been holding his breath for longer than he had realized. "I am not saying I understand your world," Reese continued, her voice firmer now. "I am not saying I approve. I am definitely not saying I am okay with whatever it is you do out there. The blood, the violence, whatever makes people disappear." She pointed at him. "But I am also not going to pretend the last 2 months did not happen, that I did not see who you are when you think no one is watching. The way you treated Martha. The way you looked at Wesley as though you would burn the world down if anyone hurt him. The way you sat in my apartment reading a book while I slept because you did not want me to be alone. Reese, I am not finished." She said it with something in her voice that made Ashton fall silent at once. Reese Fuller, owner of a small bakery, had just given an order to the most feared Mafia boss in Seattle, and he obeyed before he even had time to think. "So here is what is going to happen," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If your violence touches this bakery, these women, Wesley, anyone under my roof, I will disappear, and you will never find me. I know how to vanish, Ashton. I have done it before. I can do it again." She held his gaze without blinking. "But if you can keep your world and my world separate, if you can promise me that whatever darkness follows you will never step through that door, then the door stays open." Ashton looked at her, the first woman in his life who was not afraid of him, who wanted nothing from him, and who had just laid down the law to a Mafia boss as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She was not begging. She was not negotiating. She was drawing a line and daring him to cross it. "That is the fairest offer anyone has ever given me," he said, and he truly meant it. In his world, no one bargained fairly. No one gave him a second chance. No one looked at the monster inside him and said, "I will stay anyway." "It is not an offer," Reese corrected, her voice softer now. "It is a boundary. Learn the difference." "I can do that," Ashton said, nodding. "I will do that." They sat there in silence, but this time the silence was no longer heavy. It felt like the silence after a storm, when everything has been said and the air has turned clear again. An agreement had been made without ever being written down. A boundary had been drawn, and for the first time in his life, Ashton Kane was willing to live by someone else's rules, because she was worth that, because he wanted to become worthy of her. On the other side of the city, in a high-rise overlooking Seattle, Jasper Cole sat behind a black oak desk and listened to the report from one of his men. His office was luxurious to the point of coldness, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, expensive minimalist furniture, and not a trace of warmth anywhere. Just like its owner, Jasper Cole, 35 years old, was the boss of the largest rival organization to the Kane Empire. He had wanted to swallow Ashton's empire for a long time, but he had always lacked one thing: an opening. Ashton Kane had no weakness. No family, no friends, no one who could be threatened. The man lived like a ghost, and you could not strike what you could not hold. Until now. "Kane has been visiting a bakery," the subordinate reported, placing a stack of photographs on the desk. "Every day. Same place, same woman." For the past 2 months, Jasper picked up the photographs and flipped through them one by one. Ashton Kane, sitting in a small bakery. Ashton Kane, smiling at a brown-haired woman. Ashton Kane fixing a door like some ordinary man. Ashton Kane looking at that woman with an expression Jasper had never before seen on the face of his enemy. "The great Ashton Kane," Jasper said slowly, a smile spreading across his mouth but never reaching his cold, serpent-like eyes, brought low by a baker. How disappointing. He set the photographs down and tapped his fingers lightly against the desk. In the underworld, people told many stories about Jasper Cole. They were not stories of direct violence or public bloodshed. Jasper was smarter than that. He destroyed people's lives in ways that left no trace. Like Morrison, the man who had tried to negotiate with Cole a few years earlier. People had found his business burned to the ground, his family gone in the night, and no one had ever seen them again. No evidence, no accusations, only total ruin. Attacking Kane directly is suicide, Jasper said to his subordinate as he rose and walked to the window overlooking the city. The man has survived 3 assassination attempts. He is paranoid, careful, and ruthless. He turned back, and the cruel smile widened. But everyone has a weakness. His just happens to be adorable. He picked up a photograph of Reese, his fingers brushing across her face as if already calculating her value. We do not touch the woman. Not yet. First, we make her life miserable, break her business, frighten her employees, make her feel as though the world is closing in around her. And when she breaks, the subordinate asked, she will push Kane away, or he will do something stupid trying to protect her. Either way, he will be vulnerable. Jasper set the photograph down, and when he is vulnerable, we move in. A week later, the trouble began. Health inspectors showed up at Sweet Second Chances without warning. They found minor violations no one had ever noticed before, threatened to shut the bakery down, and demanded handling fees to look the other way. Reese paid, thinking it was nothing more than ordinary corruption. But then they came back, again and again, 3 times in 2 weeks, each visit bringing fresh demands and new threats. Then unfamiliar cars began parking across from the bakery, sitting there for hours behind darkened windows. Employees were followed on their way home. Martha arrived one morning with red-rimmed eyes and said that someone had trailed her the whole way home the night before. The young woman began to panic, trembling every time the bell over the door rang, and at last she told Reese that she wanted to quit. Reese tried to reassure her staff, but she could no longer pretend everything was normal. These were not random inspections. This was not coincidence. Someone was targeting her bakery, and she knew exactly why. That evening, after the bakery had closed, Reese confronted Ashton. She did not waste time. This started right after people found out about us, she said, tension tightening her voice. The inspections. The cars watching us. Martha being followed. Is this because of you? Ashton was silent for a long moment, and that silence was its own answer. Yes, he said at last. I think it is. Who? Someone who wants what I have, Ashton replied, his voice low and dangerous. Someone who has been waiting for a weakness, and who has just found out I have something I care about. Rage flared inside him, hot and familiar. 15 years in this world had taught him one simple lesson. When you are attacked, you strike back 100 times harder. Every instinct in him told him to crush whoever was behind this at once, to burn down everything they owned, to make them regret ever laying a hand on what belonged to him. But then he looked into Reese's eyes, and he remembered their agreement. If his violence touched this bakery, she would disappear, and he would lose her forever. For the first time in his life, Ashton Kane did not know what to do. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Ashton's phone rang through the darkness of his penthouse. He was not asleep. He had barely slept at all since learning that Jasper Cole had set his sights on Reese. He answered at once, and his heart seemed to stop when he heard the tremor in her voice on the other end. Ashton, Reese said, her voice on the verge of breaking. Someone broke into the bakery. They destroyed everything. He said nothing. He only ended the call, rushed out the door, and drove like a madman through the empty streets of Seattle. The trip normally took 20 minutes. He made it in 15. Perhaps it was the fastest he had ever driven in his life. But when he saw the bakery, he wished he had never arrived at all. The front glass door had been shattered, fragments scattered across the sidewalk and the floor inside, glittering beneath the streetlights like frozen tears. Inside was worse. The display case had been smashed to pieces. Cakes and frosting splattered across the walls like a portrait of devastation. Chairs were overturned. Tables had been knocked on their sides. The oven, the heart of the bakery, had been completely ruined, damage worth tens of thousands of dollars that Ashton knew Reese did not have. But what made him go still was the red painted message on the white wall behind the counter. Stay away from Kane. Nothing had been stolen, nothing taken, only destruction. This was not robbery. It was a warning, a declaration of war. Ashton stepped through the broken doorway, glass crunching beneath his leather shoes. His gray eyes swept over the room, taking in every detail, every loss, every trace the attackers had left behind. Rage rose inside him, but not the hot kind, not the kind that burned like fire. This was a colder rage, silent and deadly, the kind that made people disappear without leaving so much as a trace. Brooks stood behind him, his face hard as stone, waiting for the order. One word from Ashton, and Jasper Cole would not live to see the following night. One nod, and his enemy's entire empire would go up in flames. He had that power. He was willing to use it. But then he saw Reese. She was standing in the middle of the wreckage, not crying, not screaming, her face so empty it was as though her soul had stepped outside her body. Wesley stood beside her with one arm around her shoulders, his own face drained of color. Martha was crying in the corner, and the other employees who had been called in were huddled together, terrified and shaken. And Reese simply stood there, staring at the place she had built from the wreckage of her life, only to see it turned into wreckage once again. Ashton walked to her, and she lifted her face to look at him. For the first time since they had met, he saw something broken in those amber eyes. Not fear, not anger, exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had fought too many battles and no longer had the strength to fight one more. "Is this your world, Ashton?" she asked, her voice rough and frayed. "Is this what loving you means?" The word loving hung between them like a confession and an accusation at the same time. It was the first time she had used that word. And it came here, in the ruins of the bakery, amid the smell of paint and broken glass, like a flower forcing its way through scorched earth. Ashton wanted to say, "I will destroy them." He wanted to promise that he would protect her. He wanted to say that whoever had done this would pay 100 times over. He wanted to do what he did best, violence and retribution, to crush his enemies until there was nothing left to crush. But he looked into Reese's eyes and understood. Violence would not fix this. It would only prove her right, that his world offered nothing but destruction, that he could give her nothing except suffering and ruin, that loving him was a death sentence. "If you start a war because of me," Reese said, her voice trembling but steady, "more people will get hurt, more bakeries will burn, more Marthas will cry in corners." She looked around the bakery, at the frightened employees, at her brother trying so hard to be strong for her. "I do not want that on my conscience. And I do not think you want it on yours either." Then she turned back to him, her eyes wet but refusing to let the tears fall. "Find another way, Ashton. Prove to me there is another way. Prove to me that your world holds something besides destruction." She drew in a deep breath. "Or this ends here. Tonight, I will disappear like I promised, and you will never see me again." Ashton stood there, caught between the ruins of the bakery and the choice of his life. 15 years of violence had taught him one way to live, but the woman standing before him was asking for another. And for the first time, he wanted to learn. The penthouse lay in darkness, lit only by the glow of the city rising through the glass walls from below. Ashton stood before the window, looking down at Seattle spread out beneath him, the city he had ruled through fear for 15 years. Brooks stood behind him, silent, waiting. "Boss," Brooks finally said, his voice low and steady as always. "We can end Cole tonight. Say the word. One phone call and no one would ever find the body. By morning, it will be as if he never existed." That was how everything worked in their world. If someone threatened you, you eliminated them. If someone touched what belonged to you, you crushed them. No negotiation, no mercy, no hesitation. Ashton had lived by that law throughout his entire adult life. It had kept him alive. It had built his empire. But tonight, as he looked out over the city and thought of Reese standing in the wreckage of her bakery, his father's voice rose suddenly from a corner of memory, long buried. "Power means nothing if you have no one to protect, son. And destruction is not protection. Remember that." His father had said those words just before he was killed, as though he had known his time was nearly over and wanted to leave behind one final lesson. Ashton had forgotten those words for 15 years. He had buried them with his father, along with the softer part of himself he believed could not survive in this world. Until now. "No," Ashton said, his voice carrying through the dark room. "Not this time." Brooks was silent for a moment, then asked, unable to hide his surprise. "Boss?" "Cole wants a war," Ashton explained, still looking out the window. "If I give him one, more people get hurt. His people retaliate. We retaliate back. The bakery becomes a target again. Her employees, Wesley." He turned then, facing Brooks. "And Reese will never look at me the same way again. She will see exactly what everyone else sees, a monster, and she will be right." Brooks looked at him, and in the eyes of the man who had followed him for 20 years, Ashton saw something new. Not judgment, not disappointment, curiosity, and perhaps a new kind of respect. Then what do we do? Brooks asked. Ashton turned back to the city, but this time his gaze was no longer empty. We use what we have, but differently. In the days that followed, Ashton did not sleep. He used the vast information network he had built over 15 years, but not to strike, to dig. Jasper Cole was clever when it came to hiding illegal operations, but he had one weakness: corrupt officials. That was how he had sent inspectors to the bakery, how he had made everything look legitimate while destroying other people's lives. Ashton found evidence: emails between Cole and city officials, transfers into secret accounts, recorded phone calls Cole never knew had been captured. Piece by piece, Ashton built a case no lawyer could explain away. Then he contacted an FBI agent through a private channel, a man who owed him a favor from years earlier. "I have information about corruption in the city inspector's office," Ashton said over the encrypted line. Names, dates, money trails, and the man behind all of it. Silence lingered on the other end. Then came the reply. "What do you want in return, Kane? You do not give information for free." Ashton looked out the window, thinking of Reese, of the bakery, of the new life he was trying to build. "Nothing," he said. "Consider it a civic duty." 2 weeks later, the news exploded across every channel. Local businessman Jasper Cole arrested on corruption and racketeering charges. Footage of Jasper in handcuffs played again and again, his face bleached white with shock and fury. But what caught Ashton's attention was the way Jasper looked straight into the camera before being shoved into the police car, as though he knew exactly who stood behind it all. The Kane Empire was nowhere in the story. No public evidence tied Ashton to the arrest. No bloodshed. No war. Jasper Cole, the man who had destroyed so many lives through the system, had been brought down by the very system he thought he controlled. Brooks stood beside Ashton in the penthouse, the two of them watching the news on the screen. "The old way would have been faster," Brooks remarked. "The old way would have destroyed something in me," Ashton replied. "Something I am trying to rebuild." He took out his phone and called Reese. She answered on the second ring, her voice tired but alert. "Ashton, turn on the news," he said. "Channel 5. A long silence followed. He could hear the television being switched on, the news anchor's voice spilling into the room. Then Reese's sharp intake of breath when she saw Jasper in handcuffs. "You," she began, then stopped. "You did not hurt him. You asked me not to," Ashton answered simply. Another moment of silence passed, and then Reese's voice came back, quiet and trembling, but filled with something he did not dare name. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Ashton said, and for the first time in weeks, he almost smiled. "I have a bakery to rebuild." A few weeks after Jasper Cole was arrested, Sweet Second Chances opened its doors again, but it no longer looked like the old bakery. It was more beautiful now, newer, with a modern display case, the best ovens money could buy, and a security system Reese was absolutely certain she could never have afforded. When she asked Ashton about the cost, he merely shrugged and said insurance covered it. She knew that was a lie, but she also knew arguing with him about money was pointless. So instead, she thanked him with a chocolate cupcake and a kiss on the cheek that turned the tips of his ears red. Martha came back to work, and although her hands still trembled whenever a loud male customer raised his voice, she no longer wanted to quit. The other employees returned as well, and little by little the bakery found its footing again, even becoming busier than before. It seemed the story of the vandalism and the bakery's rebirth had spread, and people wanted to support a place that had survived hardship and stood back up. Then one evening, Ashton received a text from Wesley. "Beer tonight. Just us. I will send you the address." The address led to a modest bar in the outskirts of the city, the kind of place Ashton had never set foot in during his life. There were no bodyguards at the door, no private lounge, no $1,000 bottles of liquor, only worn wooden stools, country music spilling from a jukebox, and the smell of cheap beer. Ashton walked in feeling as if he had stepped onto another planet. Wesley was already there at a table in the corner, his cane propped against the wall. He ordered 2 bottles of beer and pushed one toward Ashton when he sat down. "I did more research on you," Wesley said, without pretense or delay. "The real kind. Not just Google. I asked around. Talked to people who know people." Ashton wrapped his hand around the bottle but did not drink. He only waited. He had prepared himself for this, for rejection, for the warning that he needed to stay away from Reese, for the look of judgment he had seen too many times in his life. I cannot accept this, Wesley said, his voice serious. Ashton's heart seemed to stop. This was what he feared most. Not enemies, not bullets or knives, but being rejected by the family of the woman he loved. Then Wesley smiled. That mischievous smile Ashton had come to recognize so well. That is what I would say if I were an idiot. Ashton blinked. What? Wesley burst out laughing, nearly spitting out his beer. Relax, tough guy. I am messing with you. You should see your face right now. The great Ashton Kane, terrified by a college kid with a bad leg. Ashton was not sure whether to feel relieved or irritated. He chose instead to take a swallow of beer and hide both. Wesley grew serious again and set the bottle down on the table. Look, I am not going to pretend I understand your world. I do not. I probably never will. You have done things that would give me nightmares if I knew the details. He paused, looking Ashton directly in the eye. But I know one thing. You could have killed that Jasper guy. Everyone in your world expected you to. Hell, I expected you to. That is how it works, right? Someone hurts what is yours, and you destroy them. Yes, Ashton nodded. That is how it usually works. But you did not, Wesley continued. You found another way. You took him down without spilling blood. Not because you could not, but because Reese asked you not to. He tilted his head, studying Ashton as though he were seeing him anew. I do not understand your world, but I understand one thing, protecting family, and that is exactly what you did. You protected her. Not just from Jasper, but from the violence that would have come after. Wesley reached his hand across the table. So here is the deal. Hurt my sister, and I will find a way to make you regret it. I do not care how powerful you are. I will hire your own people to do it if I have to. Ashton looked at that outstretched hand, then up at Wesley's face. A 21-year-old young man with a cane and the heart of a lion. Reese's final protector, and now, perhaps, his friend as well. Ashton took Wesley's hand, and the corner of his mouth lifted, the closest thing to a smile Wesley had ever seen from him. Fair enough, Wesley nodded in satisfaction, then added, Also, you are paying for beer, forever. I can live with that, Ashton replied. After that, they sat drinking in an easy silence. Two men from entirely different worlds who shared one thing in common. They would both do whatever it took to protect Reese Fuller, and sometimes that was all it took for two people to understand one another. That night was an ordinary night, no different from so many others. The bakery had closed. The last customer had been gone for quite some time, and sweet second chances rested beneath the glow of warm yellow light. Soft music drifted from the old radio on the counter, a slow jazz song Reese liked to play while cleaning up. The scent of cake and vanilla still lingered in the air, familiar and comforting, like an embrace. Ashton and Reese were tidying the bakery together, a routine they had fallen into over the past months without ever needing to name it. She wiped the tables. He stacked the chairs. She swept the floor. He took out the trash. Simple, ordinary motions, yet somehow more intimate than any candlelit dinner Ashton could have imagined. He stopped in the middle of lifting a chair and looked at Reese. She was bent over, scrubbing at a stubborn mark on one of the tables, her hair falling loose from its knot, a few strands clinging to her cheek. There was a streak of flour across her cheekbone that she had not noticed, and her apron was wrinkled from a long day's work. She was not glamorous, not perfect by the standards of glossy magazines or the women Ashton had once known in his world, but she was real. So real it hurt. So real that Ashton was no longer sure he deserved to stand in the same room with her. I do not know how to do this, he said suddenly, his voice sounding through the quiet bakery. Reese looked up, her amber eyes full of curiosity. Do what? Ashton set the chair down and turned to face her, though he did not step closer, as though he feared that if he came any nearer, he would lose the nerve to speak at all. This, the normal things, the I love you, and the planning for the future, and all of it. He swallowed hard, hating how uncertain and vulnerable his own voice sounded. I have never said those words to anyone. Not once. Not to anyone. I do not even know whether I know how to mean them. Reese set the rag aside and walked toward him slowly, as though approaching a wild creature she did not want to frighten. She stopped right in front of him, close enough that he could catch the scent of vanilla in her hair, and placed her hand against his chest, right over his heart. He knew she could feel how fast it was beating. Then do not say them, she said softly. Ashton blinked. What? Do not say them if you are not ready, Reese repeated, her eyes holding his. Words are easy. Anyone can say I love you. It costs nothing. It means nothing if the actions do not match. She smiled then, that gentle smile he had loved for a long time without ever daring to admit it. Show them instead. You have been showing them for months, Ashton. Every time you fixed something in this shop, every time you sat with me when I was sick, every time you protected Wesley without being asked, every time you chose not to be violent when violence would have been easier. She paused, her fingers tracing slow circles against his chest. That is love, even if you do not have words for it. I see it. I feel it. And that is enough for me. Ashton looked at her. This woman who had seen the darkness inside him and still chosen to stay. The woman who had given him boundaries instead of ultimatums. The woman who had taught him that strength was not only destruction, but building too. I can do that, he said, his voice low and certain. I can do every day. I can do showing up until it becomes who we are. That is all I need, Reese replied, rising onto her toes to bring her face closer to his. I do not need perfect, Ashton. Perfect is boring. I need present. I need someone who shows up, even when it is hard. Present I can do, he whispered, and then he kissed her. There were no fireworks, no dramatic music, no grand confession or impossible promise. Only his mouth on hers, gentle and real, in the little bakery that smelled of vanilla and butter. Only two people who had once believed they would be alone forever, finally finding each other in the wreckage of their lives. And when they pulled apart, forehead resting against forehead, breath mingling, Ashton thought that this was the moment he would remember for the rest of his life. Not the victories in the underworld, not the empire he had built, but this night, in the little bakery, with the woman who had taught him how to love. 4 months passed like a gentle dream Ashton scarcely dared believe was real. Sweet Second Chances was busier than ever, with 5-star reviews online and so many regular customers that Reese had to hire 2 new employees. Wesley was about to graduate from college, had already received several offers from good companies, and had finally stopped looking at Ashton as if he might disappear at any moment. Martha had grown far more confident, so much so that she had even talked back to a difficult customer the week before, an event the whole bakery had celebrated with applause. Ashton and Reese did not make their relationship public. There was no need. Anyone with eyes could see it, the way he appeared at the bakery every day, the way she smiled whenever he walked through the door, the way they touched each other as though it were the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in his life, Ashton began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to be happy. That a blood-stained past did not necessarily have to define the future. That he could have an ordinary life, with an ordinary woman, in a little bakery that smelled of vanilla and butter. Then the bell over the door rang on a Thursday afternoon, and everything changed. Ashton was not at the bakery that day. He was handling business at the office. Reese stood behind the counter, decorating a birthday cake when she heard the bell. She looked up with a professional smile, ready to welcome a new customer. The smile died on her lips. The man who walked in looked about 35, polished in a way that felt just a little too deliberate, wearing a suit that did not quite fit and an expensive watch that looked fake. His hair was carefully slicked back with gel, and the smile on his lips never reached his cold eyes. Reese knew that smile. She had once loved that smile, once believed the lies behind it, once thought it meant happiness. "Hey, Reese," Drew Mercer said, his voice sweet as poison. "Long time no see. Miss me?" Drew Mercer, her ex-husband, the con artist who had vanished 5 years earlier with everything she had, leaving her buried in debt and heartbreak. And now he stood in her bakery as if he had every right to be there. "Get out," Reese said, her voice like ice even though her heart was pounding wildly. "Now." Drew lifted both hands in mock innocence. "Whoa, hostile. And here I thought we could catch up, talk about old times. Remember the good days?" "We have nothing to talk about," Reese replied, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "You left. You disappeared. You took everything and vanished. We are done. We have been done for 5 years." Drew did not seem affected in the least. He looked around the bakery and let out a low whistle. "Nice place you have got here. Business must be good." His eyes paused on the new display case, the expensive security system, the details no ordinary little bakery could possibly afford. "Or maybe you have got a new investor?" He turned back to her, and his smile changed into something more dangerous. "I heard you are seeing someone these days. Someone very rich, very powerful. Very dangerous. Reese said nothing, but her silence was enough to confirm it. "What do you want, Drew?" she asked, deciding to stop pretending and get to the point. Drew stepped closer to the counter, closer to her, and Reese had to force herself not to step back. "Just what is fair," he said, lowering his voice. "See, I have been thinking a lot about our marriage, about the way it ended, about certain transactions that happened right before I left." Reese felt her heart stop. "Remember when my accounts got emptied?" Drew continued, his eyes narrowing. "All $50,000? Just gone. Like that. I always wondered who did it. Took me a while to figure it out, but now I have a pretty good idea." She said nothing. She could say nothing, because he was right. Drew smiled, the smile of a man who knew he was holding the winning card. "Theft is a crime, Reese. It does not matter why you did it. It does not matter that your brother needed surgery. The law does not care about sob stories." He tilted his head, pretending to think it over. "I wonder what your dangerous boyfriend would think if he knew his perfect little baker is a thief. I wonder what the police would say." "What do you want?" Reese whispered again. $200,000, Drew said calmly, as if he were ordering coffee. "Call it compensation for pain and suffering, and interest. You took 50, you pay back 200. Seems fair to me. I do not have that kind of money." "Then find it," Drew said with a shrug. "Sell this place. Ask your rich boyfriend. I do not care how you get it. I just want my money." He placed a card on the counter and slid it toward her. "You have 1 week. After that, I go to the police. And your perfect new life falls apart." Drew turned and walked toward the door, but paused on the threshold to add one last thing. "Nice seeing you, Reese. You look good. Success suits you." He smiled one final time and disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. Reese stood there alone in the silent bakery, the card lying on the counter like a ticking bomb. Her biggest secret, the thing she had buried for 5 years, the thing she had never told anyone, had just been dragged into the light, and she had no idea what to do. That night, Reese called Ashton to her apartment. Her voice on the phone was trembling in a way he had never heard before, and he was there within 10 minutes without asking a single question. When he stepped inside, he found her sitting on the sofa, knees drawn up to her chest, both arms wrapped tightly around her legs. She looked smaller than ever, as though she were trying to fold herself inward and disappear from the world. "What happened?" Ashton asked at once, moving quickly to her side. He sat down beside Reese, but he did not touch her. He only waited. Reese did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the floor, her amber gaze dull, as though she were staring into a past she desperately wanted to forget. "Drew came to the bakery today," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Ashton went still. He knew who Drew was from what Reese had told him. The con artist, the ex-husband, the man who had shattered her life and vanished. What did he want? "Money," Reese answered. $200,000. Or he goes to the police. "For what?" Ashton asked, unable to understand. Drew was the fraud. He had no right to threaten anyone, unless... Reese drew in a deep breath, and when she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, there was something in them he had never seen before. Shame, fear, and the grim acceptance of someone prepared to face the consequences. "When Drew disappeared 5 years ago," she began, "Wesley was in the hospital. He had just had his accident. The doctors said he needed surgery or he might lose his leg. Maybe worse." She paused and swallowed hard. "No insurance, no money, bills piling up every single day. I was working 3 jobs, but it was not enough. It was never going to be enough." Ashton listened without speaking. "Then I found out Drew had a secret account," Reese continued. $50,000. Money he was hiding, probably from some scheme or scam. Money he never told me about during our marriage. She lowered her eyes to her hands. "I took it. All of it." Silence. Ashton said nothing. "Technically, legally, it was theft," Reese said, her voice shaking. "We were still married on paper, but the account was only in his name. I had no legal right to it. I hacked into his email, found the bank information, and transferred everything into my account." She raised her eyes again and met Ashton's gaze. "I knew it was wrong. I knew it then. I know it now. But Wesley would have lost his leg. Or worse. So I did it." She stopped, drew in a breath, then said quietly, "And I would do it again. In a heartbeat." Ashton looked at her, At the woman who had once lectured him about boundaries and morality, who had asked him to find another way instead of turning to violence, the woman he had imagined as perfect. She was not perfect. She had done something wrong. She had committed a crime to save her brother. And somehow, that made him love her even more. "You did what you had to do," he said at last, his voice gentle. "For family." Reese blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "I have done far worse," Ashton continued, reaching up to touch her cheek. "For far less noble reasons. You did it to save Wesley. I have done things." He stopped there, not needing to say the rest. "You are not angry?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. "At you?" Ashton shook his head. "No, never at you." His gray eyes darkened. "At him?" "Very." Reese heard the shift in his voice at once. This was no longer the gentle man who had kissed her in the bakery. This was Ashton Kane, the Mafia boss who had made all of Seattle tremble. "Ashton," she began. "He will not go to the police," Ashton said, his voice cold as steel. "I will make sure of that." Reese caught his hand and held it tightly. "Do not hurt him. I mean it." Ashton looked at her, and she could see the battle raging in his eyes. The instincts of the crime lord were screaming inside him. Crush Drew. Make him disappear. Make him pay for daring to threaten the woman he loved. It would be easy. Clean. No one would ever know. "After everything he did to you?" he asked. "I do not want blood on this relationship," Reese said, her voice steady even though it trembled. "On us. If you hurt him, that becomes part of who we are, part of what we built together, and I cannot live with that." Ashton was silent for a very long time. He looked into Reese's eyes, at the woman who had given him a second chance, who had seen the monster inside him and still chosen to stay, who had taught him there was another way besides violence. "No blood," he said at last. "I promise." Reese let out a breath, as though she had just laid down a weight too heavy to carry any longer. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Ashton replied, rising to his feet. "I have work to do." Ashton chose a modest bar on the outskirts of Seattle, not anyone's territory, with no meaningful security cameras and quiet enough that no one would overhear their conversation. He sent the address to Drew in a text, brief and without explanation. Drew arrived first, just as Ashton had expected. Men like him always wanted to create the impression that they were in control of the situation. He sat at a table in the corner and ordered the most expensive whiskey on the menu, as though someone else would be paying for it. Ashton walked in, swept his gaze once across the bar, then headed straight for Drew's table. He sat down across from him, ordered nothing, offered no greeting, no social courtesy. Drew looked at him with a smug smile. "Ah, the boyfriend. I finally get to meet you face to face. I have heard a lot about you, Kane." Ashton did not answer. He only looked at him with gray eyes as cold as steel. Drew seemed faintly unsettled, though he tried to cover it with manufactured boldness. "Not scared? Most people are, from what I hear." The great Ashton Kane, terror of Seattle's underworld. He took a sip of whiskey. "Should I be scared? Should you?" Ashton asked, his voice expressionless. Drew laughed, but the sound carried less confidence than he wanted it to. "You are here to negotiate, right? That means you need something from me, which means I have leverage." He set the glass down, his self-satisfaction returning. "So let us talk numbers. 200,000 seems fair, but I am open to discussion. Maybe we can work out a payment plan." Ashton said nothing. Instead, he placed a thick file on the table directly in front of Drew. Drew looked down at it, then back up at Ashton with curiosity. He opened it, and the smile died on his mouth. Inside was the story of Drew Mercer's life. Every debt he was hiding from, every person he had conned over the past 5 years, every charge waiting for him if he were found, from financial fraud to tax evasion to organized scams. There were addresses for the victims still looking for him. There was contact information for law enforcement agencies in at least 3 other states. There were photographs of him in places he should not have been, with people he should not have met. What is this?" Drew asked, and his voice no longer carried any confidence at all. "Your life," Ashton answered calmly. "On paper, every creditor who wants their money back, every victim who wants justice, every law enforcement agency that would love to know exactly where you are right now." Drew went pale, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Ashton leaned forward, his voice low and unhurried. "Here is what is going to happen. First, you are going to sign these papers." He placed another stack of documents on the table. They confirm that you received all your money back, with interest. The $50,000 Reese took, plus 5 years of interest, which you now have. Drew stared at him in confusion. "Check your account," Ashton said. Drew pulled out his phone with shaking hands and checked his bank account. His eyes widened. It was there. The full amount, principal and interest, had been transferred that morning. "Second," Ashton continued, "you are going to disappear. Again. Permanently this time. I do not care where you go. California, Mexico, the moon. Just not here. Not Seattle. Not anywhere near Reese or Wesley." He paused, letting the words settle into him. "And third, if I ever see your face again, if you ever contact Reese again, if you ever so much as think about Wesley again." Ashton leaned closer, his voice dropping to something soft and deadly. "I will not hurt you. I promised her that, and I keep my promises." He looked straight into Drew's eyes. "But those creditors? Those victims? Those law enforcement agencies?" A smile touched Ashton's mouth, and it was the coldest smile Drew had ever seen. "They did not promise anything." Drew looked at the file, looked at Ashton, looked back at the file, and he understood. This was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. He signed the papers without another word, his hand shaking so badly that the signature was nearly unreadable. Then he stood and walked out, leaving his whiskey half-finished. Drew Mercer left Seattle that night. No one saw him in the city again. Ashton returned to Reese's apartment close to midnight. She was sitting on the sofa waiting for him, her eyes red from worry and lost sleep. "It is done," he said when he stepped inside. Reese rose to her feet and searched his face. "You did not." "No blood," Ashton replied. "Like I promised." He just reconsidered his options. Reese looked at him for a long moment, searching for signs of violence, of the cruelty she knew he was capable of. She found none. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, her head resting against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping your promise." Ashton held her in return, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head. "I will always keep my promises to you." 1 year later, on the very day of his 34th birthday, Ashton Kane stood once again in front of Elysian. The same entrance, the same warm golden light, the same scent of expensive food and the faint sound of classical music drifting out from within, but everything had changed completely. This time, he had not come alone. Beside him stood Reese in a simple black dress that somehow looked more exquisite than any gown money could buy. Wesley stood just behind them, cane in hand, though his smile was so wide that hardly anyone noticed it. Brooks was there too, for the first time in 20 years dressed not for work but for dinner with friends. Martha and 2 other employees from the bakery had come as well, laughing together and wondering aloud whether they could possibly afford to leave a proper tip in a place like this. 7 people. A family, not bound by blood, but by choice. They walked inside, and Ashton saw her immediately. Miranda, the hostess who had turned him away the year before, who had looked at him as though he were filth stuck to the bottom of her shoe. She still worked there, still stood behind the host stand with that polished, professional smile. But the moment she saw Ashton step through the door, the smile froze on her lips. Miranda recognized him. Of course she did. Perhaps she had spent the last year wondering whether the man she had rejected that night would ever return. And now he had. With a party of 7, dressed in a suit that cost more than her monthly salary, Ashton stepped up to the host stand and stopped in front of Miranda. He could see the beads of sweat beginning to gather on her forehead, the way she swallowed, the way her eyes flickered from him to the group behind him, and then back again. "I have a reservation this time," Ashton said, his voice utterly calm, as though the night a year ago had never happened. "Under Kane, party of 7. Miranda opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Of course, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Right this way, sir. Your table is ready." She picked up the menus and led them inside, her steps quicker than usual. Reese moved up beside Ashton and let out a soft laugh. "You enjoyed that, did you not?" Ashton looked at her, and for the first time in a very long while, he gave her a real smile. Maybe a little. They were led to a large round table by the window, with a view overlooking Seattle glittering in the night. 7 chairs. Enough room for everyone. No one left behind. No one forced to stand alone at the host stand and be turned away. Dinner unfolded in laughter and overlapping conversations. Wesley and Brooks had somehow discovered that they were both fans of the same basketball team and were now deep in an animated argument over who would win the championship this season. Martha was laughing with one of the other employees about a difficult customer at the bakery the week before, her voice carrying a confidence the trembling young woman of the year before would never have dared imagine. Brooks, the man who usually stood beside Ashton like a carved stone figure, was actually relaxed, leaning back in his chair, a glass of wine in his hand, almost smiling. Reese sat beside Ashton, her hand resting in his beneath the table, their fingers laced together as naturally as though they had done it all their lives. Ashton looked around the table, and the memory of the previous year came rushing back. 1 year earlier, he had stood in this very place, alone, rejected, so lonely that it had felt as though he were dying slowly from the inside out. 33 years old, with tens of millions of dollars in the bank, power enough to crush anyone, and not a single person who wanted to have dinner with him. Now he was 34. He still had money. He still had power. But more important than any of that, he had them. The people sitting around this table. They were not his blood. No one had been forced to be here. They had chosen to come. They had chosen him, and he had chosen them. This, Ashton thought as he looked from face to face around the table. This is what power really means. Not the money, not the fear. Having people to protect. Having people who choose to stay. Then Reese rose from her chair, and from somewhere she brought out a cake. Not one made by the restaurant. It was one she had baked herself. Chocolate with simple frosting, carried there in a special box she had arranged with the restaurant beforehand. "I made this myself," she said, setting it down in front of Ashton. No fancy restaurant can compete with sweet second chances. The whole table began to sing. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ashton. Happy birthday to you." Their voices were uneven. Wesley sang the loudest and the most off-key. Martha laughed halfway through and ruined an entire line. Brooks barely did more than mumble. But it was the most beautiful song Ashton had ever heard. He closed his eyes, the candle flickering before him, and thought about wishes. Last year, he had wished for more nights like this, and the universe had given him more than that. This year, he did not need to wish for anything. Because everything he wanted, everything he needed, everything he had never dared dream of, was sitting right here around this table. He blew out the candle, opened his eyes, and found Reese already looking at him with the warmest smile in the world. After dinner, when everyone had said their goodbyes and gone home, Ashton drove Reese to Alki Beach. She did not ask why. She simply sat quietly and looked out the window as the streets of Seattle slipped past. He parked in the very same spot where he had stopped 1 year earlier, on the night of his 33rd birthday, when he had sat alone and stared out at Elliott Bay with an empty heart. They got out of the car and walked along the shore, their shoes pressing into the damp sand, the ocean breeze moving softly through Reese's hair. The city lights reflected across the dark water, scattering a million glittering stars over the waves. Seattle at night was breathtaking, but Ashton was not looking at the city. He was looking at her. "I came here a year ago," he said suddenly, breaking the gentle silence between them, "the night we met." Reese turned to look at him, surprised. "You did?" "I sat in my car for hours," Ashton continued, his eyes on the water. "Right over there. I could not go home. I did not want to. I just sat there watching the city lights, holding your business card." "Because of the restaurant?" Reese asked softly. "Because of you." He turned and looked at her. "I could not stop thinking about you, about how you helped a stranger without knowing who he was, without wanting anything in return. About how you saw me when everyone else only saw an empty seat." Reese let out a quiet laugh, her awkwardness somehow endearing. "That is a lot of pressure for a cupcake girl." Ashton stopped walking, stepped in front of her, and gently turned her face toward his. In the moonlight and the glow of the city behind them, her amber eyes shone like two precious stones. "You are not a cupcake girl," he said, his voice low and serious. "You are the woman who saved me. Not from the restaurant, not from my enemies, from myself." Reese said nothing. Her eyes searched his, looking for something there. "I had a speech prepared," Ashton continued, reaching into his pocket and drawing out a small black velvet box. Something about empires and second chances and how you changed everything about who I thought I was. Something grand and eloquent that would have made you cry. And? Reese asked in a whisper. I forgot all of it the moment I looked at you. He opened the box, and inside was not the large, glittering diamond wealthy men usually chose. It was only a ring, simple and elegant, set with a small amber stone the same color as her eyes. I do not have beautiful words, Ashton said, lowering himself onto one knee in the sand. I am not good at this. I have never done this before. I have never wanted to do this before. He looked up at her, his heart pounding like a war drum. I only have a promise. I will show up, every day, for the rest of my life. I will be present when it is hard and when it is easy. I will protect you without smothering you. I will love you even when I do not have words for it. Will you build something with me, Reese? Not my old life. Something new. Something I never thought I deserved. Something we make together. Reese looked at the ring. Then she looked at him. Her eyes filled with tears, but the smile on her lips was bright as sunlight. You know I do not need any of this, right? She said, her voice trembling slightly. The restaurants, the money, the empire, any of it. I know, Ashton answered. That is exactly why I am asking. Because you are the only person who ever wanted me. Not what I could give you. The only person who saw the man beneath the monster. Reese bent down, cupped his face in both hands, and let her fingers brush across his skin as though memorizing every line of him. Then yes, she said. 1,000 times yes. Ashton rose to his feet, took the ring from the box, and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her alone. They stood there by the shore, forehead against forehead, their breath mingling in the night air. 1 year earlier, Ashton had sat in this same place, wondering whether life held anything beyond loneliness. Now he had his answer. Life held her, and that was all he needed. 2 years after that night of the proposal by the sea, their lives had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Sweet Second Chances was no longer just a little bakery on a street corner. It had become 3 bakeries, then 4, and each one carried Reese's philosophy with it. Hire women who need a second chance, pay them fairly, and believe in the people society has already given up on. Ashton invested quietly, never allowing his name to appear on any paperwork. But Reese knew. She always knew. And she let him do it, because she understood that this was how he showed love. Wesley graduated from college with honors, and accepted a job offer from a foundation Ashton had quietly established, an organization devoted to helping victims of domestic violence rebuild their lives. He was no longer the young man with the cane and the mischievous smile. He had become a man, still limping, but standing straighter than ever, ready to fight for people who could not fight for themselves. Martha, the young woman whose hands once trembled whenever a male customer raised his voice, was now the manager of the main bakery. She had learned how to stand tall, look people in the eye, and never let anyone bully her or her staff again. Sometimes Reese looked at her and wondered whether this could possibly be the same person. Brooks, the man who had followed Ashton for 20 years like a shadow, had finally taken a vacation, the first one in 2 decades. He went to Hawaii and sent back the most awkward selfies the group had ever seen. Brooks standing in front of the ocean with no idea what expression he was supposed to make. Brooks holding a tropical cocktail as though it were a live grenade. Every time a new photo arrived, the whole group laughed until tears ran down their faces. And Ashton, he was still in the life. He could not completely walk away from the empire he had spent 15 years building, but he had changed its direction. Less darkness, more legitimate business, less violence, more negotiation. Not because he had suddenly become a good man. Ashton Kane had never been a good man, and perhaps he never would be entirely, but he had a reason to change. He had someone to protect, and sometimes that was all it took. That morning, before the bakery opened, Ashton sat at the familiar table by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand. The newspaper spread open in front of him, though he was not reading it. He was watching Reese. She stood behind the counter, kneading dough for the first batch of the day, her hair tied up high, her apron dusted with flour as always. The early sunlight poured through the glass and made a golden halo around her, as though she were an angel in an old painting. The smell of fresh bread filled the room, warm and familiar as an embrace. Domestic, ordinary, perfect. Ashton took a sip of coffee and thought about the road that had brought him here. I was denied a table on my 33rd birthday, and a baker with flour on her shoulder saved me. Not from the restaurant, not from my enemies, from myself. I spent 15 years building an empire of fear. I thought that was power. I was wrong. Power is not control. Power is protection. It is having someone worth protecting. It is having someone choose to stay beside you, not because they are afraid, but because they want to. She did not fix me. I am still broken in ways that may never fully heal. I still have darkness inside me. I still do things that cannot bear the light of day. But she showed me that broken things can still be beautiful. That a dark past does not have to become a dark future. That showing up, steadily, every single day, is the most revolutionary thing a man like me can do. My name is Ashton Kane. I have done terrible things, and I was given a second chance. That is all any of us can hope for. A second chance. And someone brave enough to give it to us. If this story reminds you that it is never too late to change, press the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Do not forget to subscribe to the Mr. Dawson Long Stories channel so you will not miss stories about second chances, about the courage it takes to open your heart to another person, and about the deeper lessons life leaves with us. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever given someone a second chance? Or have you ever been given one yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We always want to hear the stories and feelings that rise from the deepest places in your heart, because every story deserves to be told, and every heart deserves to be heard. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do today may be to offer someone a seat at your table. You never know what kind of miracle may happen when you open your heart to a stranger. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and I will see you in the next video.